but it was something, and it was there. The bearing was 300 degrees from the base. It was an awesome sight, and it became even more awesome when a quick call to an adjacent radar site brought back the word that they had just picked up a target on a bearing of 300 degrees from the airbase. They were tracking it and taking scope photos. In the alert hangar, the two pilots standing the alert had been listening to a running account of the sighting, so when the scramble bell rang, they took off of their airplanes like a couple of sprinters. As the two big alert hangar doors swung up, the whining screech of the jet starters, followed by thunder of the engines, filled the airfield. The atmosphere around the Duluth Municipal Airport was closely akin to Santa Anita the instant the starting gates opened. I've been around when jet interceptors scramble, and you can twang the tension with your finger. As the people on the ground watched, they could first see the flame of the jet's afterburner disappear into the night. Then the jet's navigation lights faded out on a bearing of 300 degrees. At the radar site, they still had the target, and there were many excited people watching the big pale orange scopes as two little bright points of light began to close on a bigger blob of light. Then the pilots gave the tally-ho. They were in visual contact. But the tally-ho had no more been given than the big blob of light on the target began to pull away from the fighters and was soon off the scope. The pilots kept visual contact, though, and the radio provided the details of the chase to the now blind crew in the radar room. The two jets bored north with afterburner on, and the needles on their Mach meters passed the 1.0 mark. But still, the UFO was just as far away as it had ever been. The chase went on for a few minutes more before the pilots pulled their throttles back into the cruise position, turned, and came home. Even before they landed, the people at the airbase saw the big, round, and bright UFO rapidly begin to fade, and then it was gone. So ended the glamour, and the dog work began. Each man who had seen the UFO visually was carefully interrogated. Weather reports were collected. Radar scope photos were developed. The two pilots received special attention. The exact bearing of the UFO was measured, and 300 degrees magnetic was correct. The bundle of data was packed up and sent to Project Blue Book. The panel of experts convened. First, the radar scope photos were examined. "Those targets could be interference from other radars," said the radar expert, and he mentally ticked off 12 other similar cases of known interference. The weather data and locations and frequencies of other radars were checked out. Beyond doubt, it was interference from another radar that caused the target. Now, the visual sighting. Balloon? No. The fighters could have caught a balloon in seconds. Airplane? Same answer. These jets were the fastest things in the air. Planet or star? Out came the almanacs, and the puzzle went to the astrophysicist. Venus was on a bearing of 300 degrees from the Duluth Municipal Airport at 5:20 p.m. on March 23rd. But Venus was just below the horizon at that time, and the observers said the UFO was moving fast. Once again, the weather charts were studied. The atmospheric conditions were such that it was very possible that due to refraction, Venus would have been visible just on the horizon. The fact that the UFO faded so fast would bear this out, because the conditions for such refraction are critical, and a slight change in atmospheric conditions could easily have caused the planet to disappear. The speed, a common illusion. Further interrogation of the observers showed it had never moved. so the history of the UFO is almost brought up to date. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppold. Chapter 19. Off they go into the wild blue yonder. At 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 20th, 1952, history was made. At least, so says George Adamski, lecturer on philosophy and student of technical matters and astronomy. At 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 20th, 1952, George Adamski was the first man on Earth to talk to a Venusian. At least, so says George Adamski. I was chief of Project Blue Book at the time, and the name Professor Adamski, he had a title then, wasn't new to me. He or some of his followers had been showering the Air Force with photos of flying saucers. Letters by the gross were coming in demanding recognition of the great professor and an analysis of his photos. We obliged, and the photos were examined by the experts at Wright-Patterson Photo Reconnaissance Labs. The verdict came back, they could be genuine, of course, but they also could have been easily faked by a 10-year-old with a Brownie camera. For a few weeks we forgot George Adamski, but then the press began to clamor at our gates. The news was leaking out of Southern California. George Adamski had talked to a Venusian. We held out for a long time, but the pressure mounted, and I headed for California to find out what it was all about. As far as George Adamski was concerned, I was just another thirsty sightseer from the famous observatory on Mount Palomar when I walked into the little restaurant at the foot of this famous mountain one day in 1953. The four-stool restaurant, with a few tables, where Adamski worked as a handyman, was crowded when I arrived, and he was circulating around serving beer and picking up empty bottles. There was no doubt as to who he was because his fame had spread. To the dozen almost reverently spoken queries, "Are you Adamski?" he modestly nodded his head. Small questions about the flying saucer photos for sale from convenient racks led to more questions, and before long, the good professor had taken a position in the middle of the room and was off and running. In his slightly broken English, he told how he was the son of poor Polish immigrants with hardly any formal education. To look at the man and to listen to his story, you had an immediate urge to believe him. Maybe it was his appearance. He was dressed in well-worn but neat overalls. He had slightly graying hair and the most honest pair of eyes I've ever seen. Or maybe it was the way he told his story. He spoke softly and naively, almost pathetically, giving the impression that most people think I'm crazy, but honestly, I'm really not. Adamski started his story by telling how he had spent many long and cold nights at his telescope at the request of the government trying to photograph one of the flying saucers everyone had been talking about. He'd been successful, as the full photograph racks on the wall showed, and he thought the next step would be to actually try to contact a saucer. For some reason, Adamski didn't know exactly why, on November 19th he'd decided to go out into the Mojave Desert. He'd called some friends and told them to meet him there. By noon the next day, the party, which consisted of Adamski and 6 others, had met and were eating lunch near the town of Desert Center on the California-Arizona border. They looked for saucers, but except for an occasional airplane, the cloudless blue sky was empty. They were about ready to give it up as a bad day when another airplane came over. Again they looked up, but this time, in addition to seeing the airplane, they saw a silvery, cigar-shaped flying saucer. For some reason, again he didn't know why, the group of people moved down the road where Adamski left them and took off into the desert alone. By this time the spaceship had disappeared, and once again Adamski was about to give up. Then a flash of light caught his eye, and a smaller saucer, he later learned it was a scout ship, came drifting down and landed about a half-mile from him. He swung his camera into action and started to take pictures. Unfortunately, the one picture Adamski had to show was so out of focus, the scout ship looked like a desert rock. He took a few more pictures, he told his audience, and had stopped to admire the little scout ship when he suddenly noticed a man standing nearby. Now, even those in the crowded restaurant who had been smirking when he started his story had put down their beers and were listening. This is what they had come to hear. You could actually have heard the proverbial pin drop. Adamski told what went through his mind when he first saw the man, maybe a prospector. But he noticed the man's long, shoulder-length, sandy-colored hair, his dark skin, his oriental features, and his ski pant-type trousers. He was puzzled. Then it came to his mind like a flash. He was looking at a person from some other world. Through mental pictures, sign language, and a few words of English, Adamski found out the man was from Venus. He was friendly, and that they, the Venusians, were worried about radiation from our atomic bombs. They talked. George pointed to his camera, but the man from Venus politely refused. Adamski pleaded to go into the ship to see how it operated, but the Venusian refused this too. They talked some more, of spaceships and of solar systems, before Adamski walked with his newfound friend to the saucer and saw the Venusian off into space. At this point, Adamski recalled how he had glanced up in the sky to see the air full of military aircraft. Needless to say, the rest of Adamski's party, who had supposedly seen the contact from a mile away, were excited. They rushed up to him, and it was then that they noticed the footprints. Plainly imprinted in the desert sand were curious markings made by ridges on the soles of the Venusian's shoes. At the urging of the crowd in the restaurant, Adamski took an old shoebox out from under the counter. One of his party that day had just happened to have some plaster of Paris, and the shoebox contained plaster casts of shoe prints with strange, hieroglyphic-like symbols on the soles. No one in the restaurant asked how the weight of a mere man could make such sharp imprints in the dry, coarse desert sand. Next, he showed the sworn statements of the witnesses, and the crowd moved in around him for a better look. As I left, he was graciously filling people in on more details, and the cash register was merrily ringing up saucer picture sales. I didn't write the trip off as a complete loss. The weather in California was beautiful.